So if you've ever played or watched someone play Planet Zoo, you'll notice that a good chunk of the game is played while paused. Between animals maturing and picking fights, things around the zoo breaking down, and the fact that it's just easier to make a habitat without constant notifications going off. But out of curiosity, I wanted to see how challenging it would really be to make a zoo that never pauses. So I set the goal of trying to make a zoo in 25 years without pausing. The first thing I did before making the zoo was to see if I could switch my pausing keybind from the spacebar to something else so that I wouldn't accidentally hit it out of habit. But you either can't or I just couldn't find where to change it. So I started going about making the zoo itself, choosing the temperate biome on hard mode, of course. I was going to name the zoo No Pausing, but I changed my mind and named it No Space instead, so that every time I loaded up the zoo, I would be reminded not to hit the spacebar. When I loaded in, I took note of how small the building area was for this zoo, and for a second I thought that was going to be an issue, but then I remembered that my plan was to make a zoo without pausing, and that chances were it wasn't going to be getting all that big. My goal was to make at least 5 different habitats in this 25-year span, but to be able to actually make any habitats, I needed to set up the main path area first, along with setting up the staff buildings nearby and hiring said staff. After which I cleared 2 spots to add some exhibit animals to start off the zoo. And after browsing the Zoopedia, I settled on adding the American bullfrog and the fire salamander. After placing them both in the zoo, I added education speakers and donation bins. And that was the starting area of the zoo done. I had honestly thought it would take longer to set up the initial paths and staff buildings, but we were still in the first year, and so I jumped straight into looking for what I wanted the first habitat animal to be. Before I could actually make a decision, though, it started to rain, and so I put down an information booth so that guests could buy umbrellas, along with a souvenir shop, after which I went back to looking for my first habitat animal, deciding on the North Island brown kiwi, because they would require a smaller setup than other animals, and I wanted to get a feel for just how long it would take me to make a smaller habitat before I commit to making anything bigger, especially if I wanted to hit my 5 habitat goal. I bought the kiwis I would be needing before setting up the barrier for this habitat. I went for my typical wood and glass setup before struggling to get a path exactly how I wanted it, and by the time I had the barriers and the path in place, it was just a little over halfway through year 2. Before I continued with the habitat, though, I changed the time so that it wouldn't get dark, after which I struggled for a hot minute to get a water placement I was happy with. My next goal was to set up a shelter. That way most of the kiwis' care requirements were met before I introduced them to the habitat. And by the time I was done playing with it and had something I quite liked the look of, it was April of year 3. It was also time to finally add the kiwis to the habitat, and while I waited for them to arrive, I added a feeding trough and some food enrichment. When they got to the habitat, I was given the gift of seeing one of them run, which was very amusing. Also, understand that all I wanted to do at this point was pause the game to be able to fully focus on making this habitat. But I stood strong and finished adding the enrichment items, after which I added some donation bins and pulled out the greenery. I decided to use this ghost gum tree because I liked the color and the name, and I paired these with some silver ferns, one of which I moved into place to make it look like it was the support beam for the shelter. My choices for bushes to add to this habitat were extremely limited, and by extremely limited, I mean that there was just one option, so it was just gonna have to work. I placed quite a lot of them in the foraging box because I really liked the way it looked. I placed some cattail reeds around the water, after which I sprinkled some large king ferns around. And to finish off the foliage in this habitat, I added some coastal pigface plants around where I thought the greenery looked a little sparse. Also, some protesters came to my zoo because the keepers had taken too long to feed the salamanders. It was also snowing now, and the kiwis didn't have enough shelter in their habitat, so I made them another shelter quickly, and after fixing the terrain to their liking, that was the North Island brown kiwi habitat done. And I was a little nervous with it taking 4 years to get my first habitat done, along with setting up the entrance area. But in retrospect, I was still running on good time to complete my 5 habitat goal. I had, however, forgotten about adding rocks, so I went back through and added some where I thought they would look nice. I tried to focus on adding larger rocks and not focusing too much on adding smaller ones. My plan was to go back through after I had made all the habitats and add all the rock detailing like I usually would, if I had the time, that is. I just knew I didn't want to lose track of time placing rocks. Also, the first kiwi babies were born, and if you're wondering, yes, their run is just as amusing to watch as the adults is. Plus, the animal research was underway, and I was able to add the first enrichment to the salamander's habitat. I trained all my staff up to the next level, because with a zoo that doesn't pause, they'll all need to be performing their best. I moved along to browsing the Zoopedia once again to decide what animal I wanted to add to the zoo next. And despite initially looking for another habitat animal to add, I found these sloths and I really wanted to add them to my zoo. So I bought the available sloths and placed down a walkthrough exhibit, and after I placed down a path, I added them to the zoo. I thought about adding plants and whatnot like I've done in the past, but I skipped that and just went ahead and added the education speakers and donation bins. After which I went back to the Zoopedia to find another addition to the zoo, finding this really cool looking dude. And so I set about making a barrier for the Fosa habitat. And the way I made this habitat was actually a big mistake. I hadn't really been paying attention, and I set this habitat up in the most inconvenient spot. And later on, it made it really difficult to add other enclosures to the zoo, but that's a problem for later. The problem for now was once again adding water to the enclosure that I liked the look of, after which I had the Fosa brought to the habitat. And I gotta say, they're a lot smaller than I thought they were gonna be. Nevertheless, I added enrichment items around the habitat, after which I pulled out the greenery, throwing a variety of trees, bushes, and other plants around. And I guess it had taken a little too long to meet the care requirements for the Fosa, seeing as there were now protesters letting me know that they weren't impressed. I focused on adding the shelter next, which I didn't really have any ideas for, so I went with the tried and true method of just placing it along one of the viewing areas. And I hadn't actually finished the shelter when I realized that they needed climbing enrichment too, but I hadn't made this habitat with that in mind, so I sorted through the offered pre-built structures hoping one of them would fit nicely in here. Because building my own climbing structure didn't sound like the funnest thing to do. I think the climbing pre-builds are one of the few, if not the only pre-builds I use in this game, because while I've seen some really cool custom-built climbing structures, I have no interest in making them. And lucky for me, I didn't have to. I changed the glass to one-way glass because they were getting stressed, after which I started working on the terrain, during which it started to snow, which the Fosa didn't like one bit, so I placed heaters around the habitat. I added bedding underneath the shelter, and even with the one-way glass, the Fosa were still getting stressed. So I raised the barrier a bit to see if that would help. I also finished the shelter, which was nothing special, but it worked. And after adding donation bins and education speakers, it was rock time. I took a little extra time with the rocks in this habitat, because unlike the kiwi habitat, I thought this one would benefit a lot from a few extra rocks. And while I was at it, I went back through and added a few smaller plants around, during which the Fosa jumped on top of the shelter, which I hadn't realized was an escape point. So I moved her back down and lowered the rock, causing the problem, and this habitat was done. And since the game had been continually running, I didn't have to wait for money to build back up before jumping into the next habitat. So I set up the path for what will be an aardvark habitat. But first I wanted to finish off the staff area and miscellaneous other places around the zoo by adding walls and roofs. I used this red wall because I thought it looked nice and paired it with the terracotta roof. I also decorated the exhibits, which had the front area looking nice, except for the shops that I missed, that is. So I gave them the same wall and roof combo as the staff buildings, after which I used the decorations for the corresponding brands to finish them off. And with all the decorating done, I was ready to buy the aardvarks, after which I set up the habitat with wood and glass barriers. I made them a shelter and added a water area, after which I had them brought to the habitat. I placed down feeders and bedding before adding the enrichment, and then it was time to work on the greenery, starting with adding a few trees and placing some blue lotus plants in the water. To finish off the plants, I placed a few bushes before adding clusters of red and pink flowers to fill up the space without taking any traversable area away, after which it was rock time. I started with adding rocks around the water, using a mix of tropical and mossy rocks to get the look I wanted. I added one more cluster of rocks to the other corner of the habitat before moving on to fixing the terrain. And after a brief interlude to add another shelter to the Fosa habitat, I added the education speakers and donation bins to finish off the aardvarks. Also, you can really see what I mean when I say that I messed the layout of this zoo up. There's not really a place other than behind the kiwis to add another habitat. The aardvarks did have a rather cute baby, so that's nice at least. As I neared the end of year 11, I browsed around to figure out what animal I wanted to add to the zoo next, deciding that the cougar would be a nice addition to what I currently have going on. It was also an animal that would require a bit bigger of a habitat than what I have been making. But before I could get into that, I wanted to set up another shop area, which got really quick attention from guests. I set up a path leading just one out so that guests wouldn't crowd the back of the shops. After the barrier was set up, I went through and added benches and trash cans along the paths because the guests were littering. And after that was set up, I went back to the habitat to add a water spot. In the base for what will be their shelter, I promise that isn't the final piece. I just needed a temporary placeholder. I added some of the enrichment, after which I went through with the smooth terrain tool to make the terrain look less angular. And with that done, I had the cougars brought to the habitat and pulled out the foliage. I started with adding trees, after which I added a few water lilies, and placed bushes around the base of the trees. I had to stop to add some quiet signs because the cougars were getting stressed out. And then I went back through with these white flowers. Also, I noticed that they liked the giant rhubarb plant, and even though it didn't really go with the other plants I had added, I indulged a little and added a few before pulling out the rocks to work on the shelter. I kind of just threw a few rocks around until I had the basic shape of what I wanted, and then I went through and made it a little neater, and what I couldn't make look neater, I just covered with bushes. As I was finishing the shelter, it started snowing, so I had to make a trip back to the aardvark habitat to add some heaters. After which I went back to the cougars, and pleasantly enough, they didn't mind the snow. They were just upset about a lack of soil and short grass, which wasn't going to get fixed while it was snowing. So instead I watched this dude play with bubbles, which was honestly great. At some point the snow turned into rain and the kiwis were fighting due to overpopulation. Also, I heard them hiss, which was very amusing because that's just not the sound I thought they would make. Also, for whatever reason, I couldn't send this dude to the trade center, so I had to relog, which fixed the issue, and I was able to get back to the cougars, where I fixed their terrain, adding more soil and short grass until they were happy. And after adding education speakers and donation bins, this habitat was done. It was a touch smaller than what I had meant to make it, but either way, I was happy with the result. Also, this is when I realized that I set the zoo up in the worst way possible, and didn't leave any room to build out further. I decided that that would be a problem for later though, and instead worked on making the new shop area look better. Also, the cougars had some babies, and I was a little baffled to see spots on them. It was very cute, just not what I expected. It had also started snowing by the time I was done decorating the shops. The kiwis were also fighting again, so I collected the matured babies to put a stop to that, after which I went back to add a bathroom area near the shops, which finished off this section of the zoo. I next had to figure out how I was going to expand my zoo to add another habitat. I ended up moving the buildings I had sitting next to the Fosa habitat, which meant that I needed to place another water treatment facility behind the aardvarks. And then I made a path that connected the Fosa and the kiwis to try and better blend this new area in. Overall, it wasn't the worst fix to the issue, but I definitely could have planned the layout a little better. While I was deciding what animal to add to the zoo next, I got a notification for a displeased kiwi, which led me to go through all the habitats to refresh the enrichment items before going back to what I was doing. I made the decision to add platypus to the zoo, so I purchased them before going about setting up a barrier, which took me a while to get something I liked the look of, but I eventually had a wood and glass barrier with an underwater viewing area. And after setting up the staff door, I had them brought to the habitat. The first thing I worked on after they were in the habitat was redoing the water. It needed to be bigger and deeper to meet the requirements, which took several attempts and a lot of tinkering with, but I eventually got the water to their liking and was able to move on to adding the foliage. I started with adding a few trees around, after which I made them a shelter, placed down the enrichment items, and added some bedding. I fixed the terrain to their liking and made the water clear, before pulling the plants back out and adding some in the water, which way surpassed their coverage wants and needs. But I ignored that and forged ahead with adding more plants to the above ground part of the habitat, pausing to pick up the mature cougars before fighting could break out. I also cleared out the animals that had built up in my exhibit and animal trading centers. I didn't clear out the funny looking dudes though, because those are for a different zoo I'm working on. And I think I kind of forgot at this point that I needed to add the final touches to the platypus habitat, because instead of finishing their stuff, I added some education boards around and pulled out the vending machines to place around the zoo. I haven't mentioned yet, but besides having the goal of making 5 habitats, which after I finish the platypus habitat I will have accomplished, I also really wanted to have a 5-star zoo, which is a goal for most of the zoos I make. But there was still a good amount of time left to build this zoo, and I was already at 4 stars. And with around 7 years still left to go in this zoo, I wanted to get one more habitat in. So I set up a path around the back of the Fosa habitat, and while trying to look for my next animal, I got a notification for a high amount of litter. So I put a pause on the next habitat and placed more benches and trash cans around. And when I went back to choose an animal, I was feeling very indecisive, so I decided to think on it while I decorated the outside of all the habitats I currently have done. Starting with the Fosa, I placed a statue and some of these ridiculously cute Fosa signs behind donation bins and quiet signs. I added some tiny kiwi statues around the donation bins, and then some larger Kiwi signs by the education boards. The Cougars didn't have any fun statues, but they did have a goofy looking sign that I placed around. The Platypus also didn't have any statues, so like the Cougar, I added some signs for decoration. Also, I finally remembered to add donation bins to the Platypus habitat, which means it is officially finished, and I had accomplished my 5 habitat goal. With the decorations finished, I went back into the Zoopedia to pick the last animal I wanted to add to the zoo. I was really tempted by these sheep, but I had been purposefully picking animals that could be kept in pairs or really small groups. So instead I decided that the maned wolf would be the next and last addition to the zoo. I set up a barrier, and I probably don't need to mention that it was glass and wood. I kind of feel like that's a given by now. I placed down the enrichment items, after which I had the wolves brought to the habitat. I am aware, by the way, that the maned wolf isn't actually a wolf. Interestingly enough, they're their own thing entirely, but I'm still going to refer to them as wolves for simplicity's sake. With both of them in the habitat, I pulled out the trees and sprinkled a few around, after which I placed water into the habitat and made them a shelter. Just as I finished the shelter, I got spammed with alerts for both maturing babies and downed facilities, along with platypus research getting done. I went back and added bedding under the shelter, and they were technically already happy with their current terrain, but I wasn't, so I messed with it a little bit so that we could both be happy with it. After which I collected a handful of babies that were matured and picking fights. I placed more plants around the water, and just in general added a lot more greenery around the habitat. Also, I found the blueprint I made of my rocks from the 100-year zoo, which was a very exciting surprise, seeing as I had forgotten I saved it. And so I used that to copy rocks around the water and along the barrier. I paused my rock placing to add education speakers and donation bins. After which I made a rock wall on a section of the barrier because it would be a shame not to add at least one rock wall to this zoo. And after sinking bushes into the rocks and sprinkling a few smaller clusters around, this habitat was done. With a little over 3 more years to go, I decided to backtrack and add more rocks to most of the other habitats. I personally think the platypus habitat benefited the most and looked nicer with the added rocks. It also started snowing at one point and I had to add heaters to the maned wolf habitat. Also, I added more tropical and moss rocks to the top of the cougar shelter, which made it look more interesting and less plain. Overall, I spent about a year adding more rocks to all the habitats, before I pulled out some more decorations to add around the maned wolf habitat. Overall, I was very happy with how it was looking so far. Year 22 was coming to an end, and with all the habitats decorated and finished, it was time to decorate the other aspects of the zoo, starting with removing my rock pile off to the side, before going through to make sure all the animals had grade 3 food quality, and went through to add education boards to all the habitats, to hopefully raise the education rating and get me closer to a 5-star zoo. I also placed various other education stations around the habitats, along with some animal talk stations, after which it was time to add trees around the whole zoo. I used silky oak trees first because I liked the color, and then I went through with these maple trees to really fill in the space, and was left with a nice green zoo. I didn't do anything particularly interesting or noteworthy this last year. I pretty much just maintained the zoo. After adding a few more education boards, I went through and renamed all the exhibits and habitats to the animals they house. I also placed all the buildings and staff members into a single work zone, which doesn't really do anything, but I did it anyway. Also, I noticed that the vending machines have an animation, and I just don't think I've noticed it before, and I thought it was pretty cool. I was hanging out with the sloths as year 25 came to an end, and typically I would have ended here, but I really wanted to see where this sloth was venturing to, which was nowhere if you're wondering. I thought maybe he'd climb to the other platform, but he stopped and wouldn't go further. So I guess that's it for this video. I'd almost managed to get a 5-star rating, but it was more than halfway, so I'm counting it as a win. Surprisingly enough, this had not been as difficult as I thought it would be. The last habitat was definitely a bit more difficult to build than the first 5 had been, with the baby maturing notifications and whatnot, but I had specifically chosen animals that could be kept in pairs or small groups. And I almost don't want to imagine the struggle that adding any herd animals to the mix would have been. But that'll be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed watching. If you did enjoy watching, maybe consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.